There are short topics, that's our news. It's now time to get into our main topic of the month, K-9 and Company.
Yes.
A little spin-off show that was first broadcast on the 28th of December 1981. It got 8.4 million viewers, Rob.
Wow.
The way fans talk about it, you would have thought it got about 3 million viewers.
Or 3 people and a Dachshund called Bernard.
Yeah, it got 8.4 million viewers. Now, it's really interesting watching the material about this. J&T clearly thought he had a spin-off series here.
Yeah.
But no one was ever going to sign off on a spin-off series, so he did the whole backdoor pilot thing, really before backdoor pilots were a thing in the UK. Mm-hmm. Kind of like Mork rocking up in an episode of Happy Days. And then you go, hey, let's make a series about this guy.
Yeah. And again, J&T, we've said this so many times, he knew how to use that system, how to game that BBC system.
He did, but I think the fact he never told anyone else making it that it needed to be a series
that might come up.
Something that comes up. So that's the background. Rob, when did you first see K-9 and Company?
I had to really think about this, Dave, because you very kindly said that you'd ask this question. I would have first seen this in my early years of local club life. So around 87, 88, that sort of time. I was 12-ish, 13-ish. And at the time, I didn't like it much. I'm not big on K-9 at all, and although I always liked Sarah, having her own adventure without the Doctor seemed like a waste of time to me. The theme music was corny, and the production generally came across, oh, this was a failure from years ago because we'd taken on that received fan wisdom. So it felt like in the club we were looking at it as a bit of a curio, a weird failure, that it wasn't particularly okay to like. So that's sort of my first brush with it.
Yeah, I remember very similar vibes in fandom of real don't bother, this was a joke, it was terrible, nobody watched it, which as we said wasn't true.
No.
I don't remember seeing it at a club or on a bootleg copy. It's very possible I did, but I don't remember it. I do remember buying the VHS when that came out in the mid-90s. And I do have memories that I was quite excited to get this VHS, and I suspect that's because maybe I hadn't seen it around the club, and I was quite keen to see this for the first time. So it's quite possible I did see this when I was 14 or 15 for the first time on VHS.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
We've talked a bit about those perceptions going in. Did you still hold those perceptions before you watched this of, this is a bit of a joke?
Oh, well, going into it this time, I knew that I'd seen it probably 3 times as an adult, and thought it was perfectly fine on those rewatches as an adult. It's not some hidden gem, it's not something that blows the world away, but I remember I thought it was a perfectly fine thing, and it's always fun to watch some old, early 1980s television. So my perceptions going in this time weren't negative at all. They weren't like back from the club days. I knew I'd rewatch this, and I knew I was fine with it. So I was quite comfy popping this on, actually, from my season 18 Blu-ray set.
Yeah, I didn't realise it was on the season 18 Blu-ray set. I relied on my not my VHS copy, my DVD copy. And I probably haven't watched it since I bought the DVD copy, which is quite a few years ago now. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of this I actually didn't remember. I actually couldn't remember who the baddies were. I couldn't remember sort of all the plot strands and the like. And,
okay.
And again, most of my memory was based on stuff I've read. So it was like, this is a failure. This is absolutely terrible at setting up a series. What were they thinking? It's not as good as the Sarah Jane Adventures. And oh my God, the Sarah Jane Adventures do everything right, and this does everything wrong. And as I watched it, I thought, this is okay.
Yeah.
You're right, it's not a hidden classic. It's not a hidden gem. I'm not going to go that far. But as a little piece of very standalone television, I thought it was okay. It's got its faults, and we'll talk about those. But yeah, I quite enjoyed it. I didn't mind it at all.
Now, before we kick on any further, Dave, we've been calling it K-9 and Company, although technically the episode is called A Girl's Best Friend. So what should we call it for the rest of this review?
Look, I've always called it K-9 and Company, but again, it's that J&T hope that, you know, there would be a whole series called K-9 and Company, and this would be A Girl's Best Friend, and the next one would be something else, and the next one would be something else. I've always called it K-9 and Company.
Fair enough. A fun fact, I often pull out fun facts, Dave. We should mention to our listeners that this is the first Christmas-themed Doctor Who Universe special that's out there. I mean, I'm discounting The Feast of Stephen in the Daleks Master Plan because that's just a regular episode of the Daleks Master Plan. So this was the first Doctor Who Christmas special, and it predates the Christmas specials we got starting in 2005 by basically a quarter of a century. So again, J&T a bit ahead of his time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's start with the music because...
Okay.
Look, I think one of the more unfortunate parts of this is that the first thing you see, the first thing you hear, the first take you get of K-9 and Company is that opening titles, and they are terrible. Mm-hmm. It's very clear they only had about 3 shots of Liz Sladen that they had to get a full set of titles out of. They didn't really have a lot to do. I suspect had they actually made a full series, we would have seen a lot more work done on that.
Yeah.
Now, are you aware of Ian Levine's comments about the opening titles music, Rob?
I am, Dave. I am.
Do you believe him?
It's always hard to tell when people say stuff after the fact. I mean, to say that it was meant to be an orchestral score and he did a rough electronic arrangement and somehow Peter Howell was like, oh yeah, good enough, and that became the theme. I don't see how this would have an orchestral score when K-9 is such an electronic sort of device. The electronic theme music would seem to be what they would have wanted from the start, to my mind. But he is out there saying this, I know, so I'm on the fence here. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. There is a certain amount of believability to it because it is Ian Levine. Mm-hmm. I can certainly understand his comment when you listen to this theme now that it's sort of very one track, synthesizer music. And whether you did a full orchestra or you just did a bit more sort of work with a few extra tracks and a few different themes and some chords or whatever. And, you can sort of see that da-da-da-da-da-da, you can see how that would work as a properly orchestrated or scored piece of music a lot better. I can also say that Ian Levine is somebody who, for the, up until the present day, is always doing these projects that are never quite as good as he wants them to be, or that, he thinks that the world's going to fall in line for him and it doesn't. So I can imagine Ian Levine, this public figure that we know in Doctor Who fandom, thinking to himself, this is going to be so good that they'll get an orchestra to score it.
Right.
And
yeah.
Peter Howell getting in and going, dude, I have 10 quid to make this. Yeah. So no, you're getting a synthesizer and that's it.
Yeah.
And I can actually imagine Ian Levine having that disconnect. So I think it's probably like what was in his mind and what was in Peter Howell's mind were very different things. That's not unusual with Ian. But I do agree with him that it's not the tune itself that's terrible, it's the execution of it. And I can imagine a well-executed version of it.
Well, look, the way he describes it as, I just sent in my demo arrangement and they used it. It's almost like an apology when people have turned around and said, well, this sounds crap. He's then saying, oh, well, it was just the demo. It was just the demo. That they used the demo. So...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is an unfortunate opening moment for the program.
Yeah, I think Howell's main thing was to record John Leeson saying, K-9, and inserting it.
I do love the anecdote about John Leeson being told you have to come in and help us sing the theme tune. And he's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Oh, I haven't done one of those before. And he comes in and Peter Howell's like, right, can you just say K-9, 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 K-9. Good, right, done, off you go.
Yeah, lunch.
Oh, what? Okay, right. Yeah, it all does give the feeling of this being really done on a budget.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even more so than Doctor Who was being done.
And the shots of Liz Sladen, as you say, she's fanging around in this little Peugeot or whatever it is. She's running around in Olivia Newton-John workout gear, and then she looks whimsically at the camera. They're about the 3 shots they've got.
And the drinking wine one, which is about to crack up laughing.
Yes.
Yeah, it just feels like we have no money to make a title sequence.
No.
So let's just quickly go out for an hour, get a couple of shots, put them together and hope for the best.
Yeah.
Yeah, so not a good opening, but I think not a fair opening for the show either. Mm-hmm. Liz Sladen.
Yeah, Liz Sladen, she's back. And when Sarah Jane first appears in this story, Dave, to me, she seems very haughty. It's how it comes across to me. That's about the best way I can put it. Not quite unlikable, but she seems to have a bit of an attitude when she sort of rolls into town and rolls into the house. By the end of the show, it's not there, and she's much more like Sarah Jane, and that's fine. But this time around on this rewatch, I picked up on this, and I'm not sure I'd ever really detected it before. She just blazes in like she owns the place, and yeah, I found there was an attitude at the start of this which seemed a bit un-Sarah. I don't know if I'm going to throw you with this because it is such a weird thought even for me, but I had it this time around.
Yeah, I didn't have that as a note, but I agree with what you're saying now that you say it. I can imagine Liz Sladen as an actress saying to herself, right, well, time has passed since I last played Sarah Jane. So I need to show the audience this is not the Sarah Jane, the young girl who travelled with the Doctor. This is Sarah Jane who's a bit older, more mature, has a more serious career. It's a very actressy thing to do, whereas the audience probably isn't thinking about that at all. They're just like, I just want to see the character that I like.
Yeah.
She's like, no, the backstory's changed and my approach is different and I'm going to do this. And I think there is an attempt to sort of go, this is an older Sarah and a wiser Sarah and a more confident Sarah. And as you say, it's kind of a slightly more aloof and haughtier Sarah. But again, as she just has to start running around the countryside with a robot dog chasing bad guys, you just get back to Sarah being Sarah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right. And here's a funny thing that grabs me sometimes, Dave. It's probably best we talk about this at the start. I don't know where else to mention it. It's when I realised that K-9 and Sarah weren't actually contemporaries. I mean,
yes.
They're both memorable characters from the Tom Baker era, and relatively speaking, that's a finite period of television. Yet, they were never together in it, and I think we get this skewed idea. I say we, like the whole audience maybe, I don't know. With things like The Five Doctors, where she's there with K-9, and of course School Reunion, which many New Who fans will know. But when you're watching this, and she uncrates K-9, she has no idea what the hell K-9 is. And I always have this like mini light bulb moment. Oh, that's right, these two don't actually know one another at this stage. It always catches me by surprise.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about how J&T put this together, where he really just has sort of looked at the Doctor Who toy box and gone, who's a really popular companion everybody loved? Oh, Sarah Jane Smith. Let's get her back. What's something else that the kids really love? Because we want to sell this to kids. Oh, kids love K-9. Let's get him back. And you can imagine someone going, oh, well, they would never get... Doesn't matter. We're just going to put these things in there. What else do Doctor Who fans like? Oh, isolated villages. Oh, and they're cheap to film in as well. Let's put it in an isolated village. You can see the bits of logic coming together there.
Witchcraft, that was big in the Demons.
Yeah, and that's been in the news a lot in the late 70s. Let's do witchcraft. Yeah, you can see the bits of the toy box that he's putting together, and in typical J&T fashion, all those bits are really valuable and really worthwhile. Sarah is a popular companion. K-9 was popular with kids. Stuff filmed in English villages does tend to go well with audiences. Has there been a sit down and go, do all these elements work together and how are they going to work together? That, to me, is less so.
Well, the storyline is relatively thin when you break it down. I mean, Sarah Jane arrives. She thinks her auntie's met with foul play, so she's sort of investigating that. Brendan arrives. He takes K-9 in his stride. Sarah Jane is still investigating. Brendan's kidnapped. Sarah Jane finds him in time and saves the day. I mean, there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's basically all it is. It's like a scary English village horror for children. And maybe that's quite an interesting concept in and of itself.
Yeah, I think the concept is quite good. And after we get past the opening titles, that opening, Coven doing sacrificey stuff at night stuff, it is a pretty good opening. That did make me go, well, this is exciting. We're in an English village and we're doing occult stuff. That's usually pretty good. And I think it is a good opening. And look, there's enough plot for 50 minutes.
Yeah. Just.
If this was, absolutely. But if you compare this to The King's Demons or Black Orchid or The Awakening, there's not much less plot than any of them. Arguably a bit more than Black Orchid.
Yeah, well, that's true as well. Yeah.
You mentioned Brendan. Can we have the Brendan chat?
Sure.
I again walked into this with the received fan wisdom that he was too old and he was terrible and yada, 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 yada. I found Brendan really likeable.
I mean, he's got that nerdy kind of side to him. As I said earlier, he takes K-9 in his stride and he's like, oh, I'm sure you've got this kind of processor and this kind of memory and, blah, blah, blah. And he's just...
I'm taking 2 extra A-levels.
Yeah, oh, well, there's that too. But, and then he's like, oh, we can do soil analysis. And he's got this whole nerdy, geeky side, but he's not annoying with it. I'm not saying he's a cool guy, but he's fine.
He came across to me as the sort of young man that a typical Doctor Who fan watching this as a kid would want to grow up to be.
Yes.
And we'll have a discussion a bit later about sort of, whether this or the Sarah Jane Adventures gets the casting better. But I've seen a lot of stuff about, no, kids want to see younger kids. It's like, well, no, I think kids quite like seeing someone who's a little bit older.
Yes.
And how Brendan would go for a mainstream audience, I'm less sure. But I could imagine, 6-year-old me watching this, looking at Brendan and going, he's the guy I would like to be. Mm-hmm. He's smart and he's nerdy and he's well-read, but he's a nice guy and he helps Sarah and he's brave. He does all the things you want him to do. I think it's really good.
Yeah, he's not that prick in the leather jacket, in the studded leather jacket. I can't think of his name. Peter, is it? I can't recall.
No, and he's not a know-it-all per se. He gets excited talking tech with K-9.
Yeah.
But no, and look, Ian C is like, I didn't realise until I went onto IMDb and checked him out. He actually has a role over a couple of episodes in To Serve Them All My Days, where he plays a refugee boy who's basically sent to the school during the start of World War II.
Okay.
And plays that part really, really well. Sadly, he's at the other end of the series from the end that Matthew Waterhouse was in, so they wouldn't have worked together.
Right.
But clearly someone in the casting office, because Giles Gibbs Kent is in that as well, so clearly someone in the casting office was watching To Serve Them All My Days at some point. Mm-hmm. He was also a few years later in an episode of The Bill where he was unrecognisable. He's sort of, grown into his mid-20s by then, and he has an Italian accent, and everything else I've seen him in, including, this is a really good actor, and he actually did get a certain amount of work basically until he decided he didn't want this to be his career, and I think went into the behind-the-camera stuff. So, yeah, I thought Brendan was a really big strength of this.
Yeah, completely agree on that one.
Other cast members we should probably talk about. Colin Jevons stood out for me. Bill Fraser stood out for me. Of course, Colin Jevons had been in The Underwater Menace. I know him best as Tim Stamper from The House of Cards, or Max, now help me out here, Max Kula Quadrupledine or something.
I'm not even going to try.
No, the host at the restaurant at the end of the universe, I think in both the radio and TV series.
Yes. Yeah,
so look, an actor, and Bill Fraser, I know he's been in a lot of stuff, but I always know him as Judge Bullingham from Rumpole. They're both really good actors. The problem is that when you cast Colin Jevons and Bill Fraser, surely you're just saying to the audience, these are the baddies?
Yeah, I think so. It's a very strange village we're in, Dave. Is it a village of swingers or is it a village of cultists? Is it both? I don't know. But yeah, you sort of get a sense that, these people aren't going to turn out quite right.
Yeah, and let's talk about the village. I think that's something you've raised that's really interesting. I hadn't realised till this watch that it is actually set just near Chipping Norton, so I have actually been there. Mm-hmm. Or Chipping Norton, I should say. So I've been there. It would be great to one day get a K-9 and Company Clarkson's Farm crossover. That would be very cool, but I don't think that's going to happen. Again, I'd always perceived it as being this sort of incredibly isolated village, like a Devil's End, Aldbourne sort of thing, where, you have to drive to get there. Mm. But I think what they're really actually saying is, no, there is a town. Chipping Norton is a proper town, and then there are sort of, sub-towns around it. They're not really that isolated. It's just, as you get further from the centre, you get more farmland and less houses, but you're still sort of in a metropolitan area, if you know what I mean.
Well, the cop shop seems pretty small. It's like one of those 1 or 2 man sort of operations.
Yeah, so that's like the local cop shop, but there'll be like a proper station in Chipping Norton.
Yes.
The same way that there's a train station there and all the rest of it. So I don't think the village is quite as small as perhaps we're meant to think of it as being. Because otherwise, yes, like if you have got a village of 30 people and 20 of them are in the cult, that doesn't quite work. And I don't think that's what they're actually going for.
I'm still chuckling about the Clarkson's Farm crossover. I'm picturing them dancing around the fire, Hecate, Hecate. And Clarkson shows up, what are you doing?
That's right. Oh, the local council won't let me have a car park, but you can sacrifice. I get it, fine.
This writes itself.
Okay, we have to make this happen. Yeah, look. I think that's the case. Any thoughts you had, Rob?
Yeah, look, the size of the village does play into some of my final thoughts, which I'll get to when we get to the final thoughts. It does give a slightly claustrophobic vibe that although there may be civilization nearby, when the phone is cut, for example, which Sarah seems to take in a stride, like, oh, of course the phone's cut, But it's still like, you're cut off. This isn't modern times. You haven't got a mobile phone or anything. Brendan's missing. The phone's cut off. Who is an enemy within the village? There is a is spooky the right word? There is a scary sort of vibe to that, of suddenly being surrounded by potential weirdos, wherever you look.
Yeah, they do ratchet that tension up quite well. I was quite taken by that scene where Sarah picks up the phone and has to call a switchboard and say, "Can you put me through?" And I've gone, okay, we do forget that in the early 80s in some places this was still the case. You didn't even just get to dial somewhere, you had to get put through, which does sort of add to that sort of creepy factor. I think it's trying, and it succeeds in building up the tension, but it does it by sort of making everybody seem like they could be a bad person. And that has the strength that Sarah doesn't know where she can turn, and as it turns out, does turn to the wrong person.
Yes.
And spurn the advances of the right person. But the fact that the right person or the friendly people are being very creepy and very seductive, it's sort of a bit of a cheat, and it doesn't quite work on, regular viewing. And look, that does sort of bring me to talk about the ending of it, where I think the biggest flaw in the production is that when you watch a good village murder mystery, there should be enough clues along the way that an audience member watching can go, oh yeah, I see why it's this person. I think it's that person, or we can rule that person out. Whereas this really does sort of cheat. And in the end, Bill Fraser's the baddie because, of course, Bill Fraser's the baddie. Juno Baker and her husband are not the baddies because that would have been even too obvious, even though they've been very creepy.
Yeah. Well, they're the swingers, I think.
They're the swingers, absolutely. We'll have you in bed soon. Don't worry about that. Whereas, and we're going to make the woman who runs the post office the baddie because no one will have suspected her. And look, whilst it's good they're doing proper night filming, the filming was so bad that, okay, they take the mask off Bill Fraser, like, of course it's Bill Fraser. Then they take the mask off the post mistress, and it's so quick and so badly filmed, I was like, well, who was that?
Yeah.
And I had to go back to I pulled out the novelisation and quickly checked to make sure it was her.
Yeah.
But there was no hint about that, other than, sort of I don't think you'll be popular, but, that's what everybody says in English villages.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that aspect of the plot comes together really well.
Yeah, I mean, where could this have gone as a series, Dave? It feels like half the village are the cultists, so surely they wouldn't be in the next story along, like delivering the milk or waving as they walk their dog, like, oh, hello again. I presume Sarah Jane would have written her book and moved on to a more cosmopolitan location. I mean, she's certainly living away from the village by the time of the Five Doctors, if we take the timeline to be, the same.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. It's one that I wanted to talk about because, again, when you read a lot of reviews of this, they say, this could never have worked as a series. How could you have her just going around finding another village cult every episode? It would have been ridiculous. It's like, well, they wouldn't have done that.
No. So
I think it's unfair to say that it's set up the wrong idea for a series.
Do you think it could have been a bit Midsummery, where everyone in Midsummer gets murdered every episode?
I was going to say there are plenty of English television shows where, you have a village of 6 people and manage to have somebody murdered every week, and, oh, look, we just introduced a new family who's been living here for 20 years this week, Heartbeat's now been going for like 30 years, with a village of 6. So, it can be done, and let's not just say that K-9 and company's at fault there. But I think it's unfair to say it because I don't think that that's what they would have done. I think what the intention is to introduce Sarah, put her with K-9, explain who she is, give her Brendan, who's sort of the young audience relation figure, and then, because she doesn't live in that house, that's her aunt's house.
Yes.
So I assume the idea would be that they would go to a larger city. Now they've all met each other, and they would have a more Sarah Jane Adventures type setup. The problem is that nobody told the writer or the production team it's not in the story. And if you were redoing it now, you would have, okay, we've met each other in this nice English village and had this adventure, but I need to go back to London now. Oh, well, actually, I'm on school holidays now. Can I go hang around in London? That'll be much more fun, and I'm a bit creeped out from my experiences here. Yes, and can we bring K-9 with us? Of course we can. And we're all off to London to have adventures. Or, some other regional city. I think that's what you'll do now.
Although what's interesting with that, at least with the Sarah Jane, the haughty Sarah Jane that I've pulled out at the start of the show, she says to Brendan, like, I'm not here to be a mother, which sort of adds to the haughtiness, the way she delivers that line. Although by the end, she's more friendly with Brendan, so maybe that would be more amenable to her. But the Sarah Jane who first walks into this show, she is not interested in hanging out with Brendan or having a Scooby gang that solves mysteries.
No, and I think that, nowadays that would be a character arc where she goes from, I'm not having kids, I'm worried on my career, to, you know what, actually this is kind of making me a better person, I'm happier with kids and a robot dog, and let's all go away and have adventures, or...
Yeah.
Or, Aunt Lavinia has to go back to America, so Brendan has to go back with... there'll be a way to do it. And over time, they'll find they actually really like each other's company, and they're great at solving mysteries. And, presumably if it went to series, Brendan would meet some girl down the road who would then join the Scooby Gang and all of that sort of thing. Like you could see it going there. So I think it's unfair to say it could never have been turned into a series, but it's the fault of the show that it doesn't flag where it would go.
Yeah.
Does the Sarah Jane Adventures do it better? Look, obviously, because it dives straight into it. I don't think that having the younger kids is a huge difference to having Brendan. And again, I imagine Brendan would have had friends if they'd gone to series. But this is the difference between a pilot that RTD, a more experienced showrunner, is making, knowing it's going to series, and J&T sort of trying to straddle, oh, no, boss, it's just a one-off, I promise, with... I really kind of want this to become a series, and kind of not quite landing either.
Yeah, I think in a very particular way, this is the Sarah Jane Adventures Mark 1. It's Liz Sladen, she's having an adventure, she's got K-9 with her. But if someone was listening to this and they love Liz, or they love the Sarah Jane Adventures specifically, and they haven't seen K-9 and Company, and it's like, oh my God, I've just heard about this from your podcast, I need to see this. I'd caution that this isn't really like the Sarah Jane Adventures at all. It's a whole different era in terms of the look and the feel, the acting and all of that. I think it's being made for a slightly different audience. Liz is at a totally different time of her life. In many ways, particularly at the end, she still is much more like the Sarah Jane that left the Doctor than a much older Sarah Jane. It's a hard sort of thing to answer. I think it both is and it isn't the Sarah Jane Adventures Mark 1.
No, and you're absolutely right. There's a very big difference between a piece of television made in 1981 and a piece of television made in 2008, 2009, whenever the Sarah Jane Adventures came across.
Yeah.
What is really interesting, though, is that whilst Sarah Jane is pivotal to both, whilst both give her a young audience identification figure or two to play around with, in this, K-9 is very much the titular character. He's the one that comes in and saves the day. Yes, Sarah gets to do some judo, but, it's K-9 who comes in and lasers all the cult members and saves the day.
Was there a "hey" in there?
I think there could have been.
I think there was.
In contrast, though, one big difference is that the Sarah Jane Adventures, whilst K-9 is there, he spends most of his time in a cupboard, and they clearly don't want K-9 to be the thing that fixes everything and saves the day every episode.
That's a really good observation. I mean, I've not watched all of the Sarah Jane Adventures. I haven't even watched a majority of it. So
no, I've watched about half, I reckon.
Okay, but even from watching half, you've seen more than me, and that's a very interesting observation that I wouldn't have made, for example.
Little point from me, a lot of fans have criticised the fact that K-9 is made out of 1981 technology that Brendan can recognise. I've always just assumed that if the Doctor's leaving K-9 in 1981, he's not going to put advanced technology that's going to be stolen and copied and destroy the timelines in there.
Oh, but I'll jump in. One of the things when Brendan is going through the shopping list, you've got this, and you got this, and you got this. One of the things he says is like a nuclear motor or something.
Yes.
He says nuclear, so he does have something very technologically advanced. I don't know why Brendan would assume he has it. So park that. But I think he does have some high tech in him.
Oh, it's very high tech, but it's all stuff that is available in the 20th century, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
So like it's not some form of power source that hasn't been discovered by man yet. Like man has discovered nuclear technology. Okay, the doctors miniaturized it better, and man has discovered, or scientists have discovered how to program a computer, but the doctors does it in a really advanced way. It has a really advanced program in there.
And presumably Sarah doesn't have to dispose of the uranium every 6 months or something like that.
You would hope not.
Throw it in the back of the Peugeot and drive down to the local quarry and toss it in or something. I don't know.
Well, although that is part of the premise of School Reunion, where she's like, you left me this robot with no way to maintain it. So what did you think was going to happen? So that is a plot point that Russell T Davies does come in. Look, I think that the point is the Doctor's not going to leave technology that is centuries ahead of where mankind is in 1981.
Sure.
Like that would just be a dumb thing for him to do. And maybe, maybe this does mean that Brendan can, occasionally fix him. I don't know. And the final point I've got before we get to sort of final points is, for all of this sort of lighthearted, we're in a village and everybody's just, play acting a little bit and it's not that serious. We do get a couple of quite nasty moments. The policeman getting killed and sort of finding his body on the road was a moment where I've gone, oh, okay, that's a bit out. Oh, okay, we're being a bit serious.
Yeah, he's not knocked out and like, oh, I'm a bit groggy, and he gets up. He's been killed. He's
been killed. His body is lying in the road. So, we are going down there. And the sacrifice of Brendan, they do go pretty close to doing it. Now, as I said, I did read the novel, or not the whole novel. I read the last chapter of the novel to make sure I identified who the villains were. In the novel, Brendan is naked.
That's interesting, because when he was sitting on the wall in that bedsheet they've got him in, there was a big split up his leg, and I thought, I'm not sure he's wearing underpants.
No, the novel makes it very, very clear that he is a naked virgin sacrifice.
Yeah.
Whereas obviously in this, they put the bare minimum on him. But they still go pretty out there.
Literally, I could tell they were really going for that vibe, which is present in so many sort of Hammer films of the 1970s and all of that. And yet this is ostensibly for a more kid audience. It's like nothing they would do today. They wouldn't put a young boy or young girl in a sheet with nothing underneath and suggest they're about to be killed. No way.
Yeah, it's not quite Children of the Stones, but it's certainly, a reminder that we are in 1981, yeah.
Yeah.
Final thoughts from you, Rob?
Dave, I think if someone likes K-9 or Sarah Jane, this is a must-watch at least once. Let the theme music just wash over you. Just marvel at how old the early 80s look these days and just have a bit of fun. It doesn't lead anywhere, but it doesn't have to. In fact, if they'd known this wasn't going to get picked up, or if J&T didn't have visions of having a whole series, maybe they could have fleshed this out a little more, maybe made it a one-off telly-movie sort of thing. I think the motivations and the relationships between the cultists in particular could be teased out a bit more, and we could see a bit more of that going on behind Sarah's back and that sort of thing. So, there is a good story lurking in there that could be teased out a bit more. I think it's worth a watch at least once.
Yeah, I think it's quite a fun watch. I did enjoy getting back to watching it. I think there's a lot to commend it here. It is a good isolated English village. It's got Liz Sladen playing Sarah Jane. That's always great. K-9 is actually used quite well here, and better than I think in a lot of Doctor Who TV stories. Brendan is a great character. I really enjoyed Ian Sears' performance. It's got Bill Fraser. It's got Colin Jevons. This is a really good cast. Yes, the fault is that it's clearly done in a rush. Terence Dudley, who wrote the script, and let's face it, is not a great script writer, has written a very basic script that's cheating a little bit too much. But as a little adventure introducing K-9, Brendan and Sarah, it works perfectly lovely, and I agree with you, it does remind you how long ago 1981 was, and it was a different time. So taken as what it is, I think it's a perfectly enjoyable little artifact. I think that the series would have been quite different to the pilot had it ever happened, but you can see the germs of the Sarah Jane adventures here.
Oh, definitely, and that's fun.
That is fun. So I'm really glad we just randomly decided to watch that.
Yeah, it was something different.
Now, Rob, we have a number of listener emails.